Today's episode of Off the Timeline is titled, What if Pat Dye took the Pitt job instead of Auburn? There are people in Western Pennsylvania who still talk about one football game like it was the last night of an era. Not a Super Bowl, not a national championship, a regular season game. November 1989, Miami versus Pitt. Snow falling sideways, frozen bleachers, national TV cameras struggling through the weather. And on one sideline stood Pat Dye, a Southern coach who somehow became the face of Pitt football. Pitt won that night 9-7, but years later people would remember something else. Because even though Pitt won the game, it still felt like college football was changing underneath everyone's feet. And in this college football alternate history, one coaching hire in 1981 changes not just four football programs, but the entire direction of the sport. And now we set the table for the hire that changed everything. In 1981, Pitt was still one of the biggest brands in college football. Sounds strange now, yes, but at the time, they had national respect, NFL talent, a huge regional recruiting influence, and one of the toughest football cultures in America. Then Jackie Sherrill leaves. In real life, Pitt hires Foge Fazio. But in this alternate history, they go in a completely different direction. They hire Pat Dye. You may be thinking to yourself that Pat Dye feels like the most SEC coach imaginable. And honestly, that's what makes this alternate history so fascinating. Because when Dye arrives in Western Pennsylvania, he unexpectedly connects with the region immediately. Not because Pittsburgh felt Southern, because it felt familiar. Steel Town football culture reminded him of an older version of the sport, community-driven, physical, emotional, deeply tied to local identity. And then he meets Dan Marino. Instead of Pitt slowly drifting after Marino, Pat Dye builds the entire program around keeping Western Pennsylvania football relevant nationally, and that changes everything. But the real reason this universe goes off the rails is because another program hundreds of miles south is simultaneously changing football forever. And that sets the table for Miami in the TV era. At the exact same time Pitt is doubling down on regional identity, Miami is becoming the first fully national TV program of the modern era. And here's the important thing. In this universe, Miami's not the villain, they're the future. You still have Howard Schnellenberger, Jimmy Johnson, elite Florida recruiting, speed everywhere, and TV appeal growing at exactly the right time. But now, Miami collides directly with Pitt for recruits, TV spots, and national attention. And the conflict becomes larger than football. Pitt represents regional identity, continuity, and hometown tradition. Miami represents a national fan base, TV growth, broader opportunities, and a new era where geography matters less. At one point in this alternate history, a Miami assistant coach says something that perfectly captures the divide. For decades, the sport belonged to a handful of regions. TV didn't destroy college football, it opened the doors wider. That line spreads everywhere, because depending on who you ask, it's either completely true or the exact moment college football lost something irreplaceable. And meanwhile, the school Pat Dye never coached is beginning to feel the consequences. And that sets the table for the Auburn timeline. Without Pat Dye stabilizing the program, Auburn changes dramatically. They don't collapse. That would be way too realistic. Instead, Auburn becomes permanently restless. The program still has talent, support, and ambition, but it never quite finds its identity. And no player reflects that more than Bo Jackson. In this alternate history, Bo is still incredible, but now his career feels different emotionally. Because Auburn spends a decade trapped between worlds, trying to keep traditional SEC identity while also trying to compete in a sport becoming increasingly nationalized. Bo becomes symbolic of that tension, a once-in-a-generation player carrying the expectations of an entire region during a moment when the sport itself is changing. And older fans watching years later would ask the same question. What if Auburn had found its footing sooner? But while Auburn searches for itself, another coach out west starts studying Pitt obsessively. And that sets the table for Colorado building the western version of Pitt. Bill McCartney watches the Pat Dye build at Pitt and becomes fascinated, not by the schemes, but by the identity. McCartney sees that Pitt isn't just selling wins, it's selling belonging. So Colorado evolves differently too. Instead of chasing national trends, Colorado becomes physical, cold weather tough, emotionally tied to regional pride, and deeply connected to fan identity. And for a while, It works beautifully. By the late 80s, Miami represents the future, Pitt represents continuity, Colorado represents adaptation, and Auburn represents a proud program trying to rediscover itself. Then comes the game that defines the universe, and that sets the table for the snow game. 1989, number one Miami, number two Pitt, national TV, blizzard conditions. The contrast is incredible. Miami arrives looking completely comfortable in the spotlight, like a program built for national TV. Pittsburgh feels heavy, industrial, emotional. The crowd isn't just watching football, it feels like they're defending part of their identity. And for 4 quarters, Pat Dye slows the game into absolute chaos. No rhythm, no glamour, no track meet, just field position, defense, and survival. Pitt wins 9-7. The stadium erupts, and for one night, it feels like regional college football still matters more than TV branding. But the ending matters most. Because as Miami walks off the field, there's no sense of collapse, no feeling that their era ended. Why? Because they understood something everyone else was still resisting. The future belonged to national visibility, TV, recruiting reach, conference power, and brand identity. Pitt won the game, but college football itself was still moving toward Miami's world. And deep down, everyone knew it. And 15 years later, one final moment quietly confirms it. And that sets the table for the ending. It's 2004. An older Pat Dye sits in a quiet restaurant watching college football on TV. Corporate sponsorships everywhere, massive TV graphics, realignment rumors. The sport feels larger than ever, and smaller somehow at the same time. Then ESPN unexpectedly shows highlights from the 1989 snow game. The restaurant goes quiet. Fans stare silently at the screen. One person softly says, "That was the last time it still felt regional." And that's the emotional center of this entire alternate history. Not that one era was better than another, but that college football changed from something deeply tied to place into something national. Some things were gained, some things were lost. And depending on when you grew up, you probably still feel one side of that trade more than the other. And if you enjoy this college football alternate history, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see you in the next timeline.